Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third Faculty of Forestry Research Seminar of this academic year. It's great to see all of you here attending the meeting and seminar via virtually or in person. My name is Taran Solati. I'm the Associate Dean, Research and Innovation in the Faculty of Forestry. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the UBC's Point Grey campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people who passed on their traditions, cultures, and history from one generation to the next on this site for thousands of years. We are grateful to have this land and have our research seminar series today on this land. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Terry Sunderland. Dr. Sunderland is a professor in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences and has around 30 years of experience in tropical forestry. His career gradually transitioned from ecology and biology into social sciences. He received his master's from the University of Oxford and his PhD from University College London. After more than 15 years of working and living in Cameroon, he moved to the Center for International Forestry Research in 2006, where he was cited in Indonesia for the next 12 years. He originally led the center's research team on landscape management for environmental services, biodiversity conservation, and livelihoods. In the last 5 years of his tenure at the center, he developed a new program focusing on forests and food security that evolved later on into the research theme, Sustainable Landscapes and Food Systems. In January 2018, Terry joined the Faculty of Forestry. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sunderland. Thank you.
Do we have to do something with this? Okay, while you're setting that up, thank you very much. I've been here almost 5 years. This is my first opportunity to speak at a faculty seminar for various reasons. It's always, my clicker is, of course, it's not going to work. I will use this. There we go. So, I'm English. I like English soccer, and Phil and I have been talking about this, about people's home form and people's away form. And I support a team called Leeds United. I've supported them since I was about this big. They have the worst home record of any team anywhere in England. And it's a bit like presenting to your home crowd at a university or your institution. It's more anxiety-inducing, more intimidating, because you've got to face your colleagues every day. If you go to an anonymous conference, you don't have to see those people again. So be kind, I will do my best, and I'm going to try and introduce as much as I know about forest and food security and health in the next 45 minutes or so. So when I first came here to UBC, the question I was asked is, what the heck have forests got to do with food security? And the person who asked me that question asked me not out of any hostility, but absolute bewilderment. Nobody really understands, a lot of people don't understand that forestry is broader than the image that we see here in British Columbia, the production of forestry systems, which are but a snapshot in time of the evolution of forests, not just in BC, but throughout the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our history as hunter-gatherers. For 98% of hominid history, the last 300,000 years, we have been hunter-gatherers in various contexts, living in small bands, harvesting small amounts of food, living in equitable societies. and harvesting a range of forest products at various times of the year. Seasonality was important. The diversity of products for dietary nutrition was important, etc. And there's a very seminal work by James Sussman looking at the history of human societies from a hunter-gathering perspective and describing them as affluence without abundance. They had enough, but not too much. They had lots of leisure time, and contemporary indigenous societies who are still practicing hunter-gathering practices, particularly areas like the Philippines, the ACTA, as soon as they transition into agricultural practices, lose a large amount of their leisure time. Even though they have large amounts of leisure time, they're also very active. Obviously, they still have to hunt, they still have to forage, they still have to gather fruits, nuts, whatever it is. Generally, these societies are well nourished. Resources are pooled, but often stored. And that's an important distinction. It allows that nomadic nature not to be held back by the fact you've got grain or whatever it is stored, not grain, but other fruits stored. And these societies are highly egalitarian. And when I was writing this out last night, it reminded me this is a bit like academia. Okay, that one didn't go well, did it? So, forests, trees, and people overlap. Some recent work by Pete Newton and his colleagues at Colorado State show that 1/4 of the world's population live within 5 kilometers of a forest, but crucially, 2 billion people derive direct and indirect benefits from forests and trees, particularly in the tropics. And I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the tropics. Another paper that was published last year by Giacomo Fedele, who I used to work with in Indonesia, looking at the reliance, dependence on nature using proxies of water, food, ecosystem services. So there's a very high reliance, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. But how do we get to this? This is the forest frontier in the Amazon basin. Essentially, we have what's perceived as forest. It is forest indeed, and this huge cut-off, this huge transition to the agricultural sector, and this is soybean, in fact. So how do we get to this? How do we get to this huge dichotomy between forests and agriculture, and no integration, never the twain shall meet? So around 12,000 years ago, we emerged from the last ice age, and the Holocene, as it's been called, the epoch of the Holocene, has been characterized by an extremely stable climate, which allowed the advent of agriculture. So the last 12,000 years have been, in comparison to the Pleistocene or previous epochs, extremely stable climates, not too cold, not too warm, but enough for human societies to start thinking about being sedentary, start domesticating plants and animals, and moving towards settlements, urbanization, statehood, societies, and the world we live in today. Initially, there were many, many plants. The diversity of plants grown in domesticated systems were much higher than they are now. And we've seen a massive trend towards dietary simplification, primarily because of mechanization. So mechanization in the late 1800s, early 1900s led to larger areas of intensive cultivation and fewer crops. And we see now today that only 12 plant crops, 14 animal species provide the majority of the world's dietary needs. Wheat, rice, and maize provide more than 50% of global energy content. So we've narrowed our genetic agriculture base significantly to our detriment. I'm going to talk about that in a second. If my clicker is going to work, which it isn't. So there's a whole bunch of global processes. The HLP, which is the high level, I can't remember the acronym now, the nutrition report from 2017, high level panel of experts, there we go, described our current food system as we produce more food than ever before, but particularly in terms of calories. And there's an important distinction between calories and nutrition. And I'll talk about that in a second. Much of our food is wasted, up to 33%, a third of the food is wasted. And we have vast inequities in the food system. So food sovereignty is a huge issue as well. we have a dietary shift from primarily plant-based complex carbohydrates to the processed foods we see today. Commodity crops high in fats and oils, meats and refined carbohydrates, processed foods essentially. As food systems have become incredibly simplified, we look at monocultures. We're used to monocultures of wheat, rice, maize, or whatever they may be. And our dietary transitions have been driven by purchasing power, but also increased urbanization. So our food system has been described in many terms as broken, not fit for purpose, for many reasons. And this paper came out a couple of months ago. And basically, if a title of a paper could describe exactly the content, well, a title becomes an abstract. This is well worth a read. But basically, there's a really nice summary of what the paper states in terms of why our current food system is broken. We have over 820 million people still suffering from hunger. The food insecurity affects a lot of people. 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. 71% of all deaths are attributed to non-communicable diseases. 2 billion people are overweight or obese. So we have this feast or famine. People either don't have enough to eat or they have too much to eat. 422 million people have diabetes, as if we know the figures are correct. I've mentioned also food waste. Greenhouse gas emissions are attributable, large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions attributable to agriculture. And on average, 70% of freshwater use is diverted towards livestock and food production. And 80% of the food produced will be consumed primarily in urban centers. No surprise there. But the big thing that's missing here for me is deforestation. Agriculture is the largest driver of deforestation, whether it's temporary, particularly through shifting cultivation, but primarily through permanent transformation. And agriculture is responsible for 40% of permanent forest loss. So that's the conversion of forests to commodity crops like oil palm, soy, cattle, etc. That forest isn't coming back. So I want to touch on the issues of how forests can contribute to food security in many different ways. And there are three main pathways. One is essentially direct provisioning, direct contributions to the harvest of bushmeat, fruits, etc., which contribute to human nutrition and dietary diversity, both for subsistence and safety nets. Swidden agriculture, managing forests and landscapes for food. I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail. And indirect contributions, so ecosystem services. Again, I'm going to touch on that in more detail. Forest-generated income, people using forest products to access the market economy, whether it's timber and non-timber forest products, freshwater fish, etc. Fodder for livestock, and a big one for 2 billion people is wood for energy and cooking, boiling water to making water drinkable. So this direct provision of food, an estimated just under 1% of forest foods contribute to the dietary diversity of the global food energy supply, but they're highly nutrient dense and they provide a very important aspect of increased nutrition, increased dietary diversity in areas where people are forest proximate. Bushmeat, fish, and insects are important protein supplies, particularly in the absence of proper livestock, other livestock, cattle, chickens, etc. And forest foods also play an important role as a safety net. If your crops fail, what do you feed your family? And wild foods play an incredibly important part in providing that safety net. So in terms of food availability, one of the things that we started to look at was this relationship between dietary diversity and forest proximity. And we used demographic health data, the USAID's database, and overlaid that with remote sensing information. Looked at 23 countries in Africa and the entire archipelago of Indonesia, and found there was a strong relationship between dietary diversity in children and proximity to forests and trees. But critically, independent of poverty, you didn't need to have access to the cash economy to have a better diet. So access to wild foods and forest proximity made the difference. That was the correlation. This is kind of a big deal, because the common perception is out of the forests, out of poverty, and better diets. So this was really a stimulus to develop this program of forest and food security when I was at C4 a few years ago. The other aspect of how forests contribute towards agriculture is in their sustenance. So we know that many ecosystem services contribute to agricultural productivity, and I'm going to give you a few examples. So this is a working group that's been set up by FLAIR, the Forest Livelihoods and Research Organization that's run out of the University of Michigan. And we're generating evidence to look at how forests and trees contribute towards agricultural productivity in a number of ways. And this is based on a systematic review that was published in 2017, a 5-year-long process of reviewing the literature and understanding how those relationships play out, both on the ground and more conceptually. So in terms of forest sustaining agriculture, there are complex relationships. Everybody recognizes the male flowers of oil palm, I'm sure, and the complex pollination systems that occur with oil palm. Just to say, I'll say it very quickly. When oil palm was first introduced to Southeast Asia, pollination was extreme, or yield was extremely low because of pollination issues. In the mid-80s, some Malaysian scientists actually traveled to Cameroon, identified the pollinator, which was the euglossine thrip, introduced it to Southeast Asia, and it increased yields by 6-fold. But the thing about that little thrip is it likes to overnight in forest patches. So the further away you get from forest patches, you get diminished pollination services. The thing about that is this is before Rio 1992. If that had happened afterwards, the reparations of that genetic transfer and the increase of the oil palm industry in Southeast Asia would have an interesting economic balance in terms of is Cameroon owed the fact that that pollinator has now been responsible for creating an entire industry in Southeast Asia. Issues of equity come into food security all the time. Cocoa and coffee grown under canopy suffer less pests and diseases. Water regulation is extremely important for agriculture, as is climate regulation. I'm going to touch on wheat in a second. But the critical thing here is we don't understand really how landscape configuration in some of these complex tropical landscape mosaics play out on the ground. And that's something that we've been working on. And Sarah Gergel, I don't know if she's here, she's probably online, led a really cool paper in bioscience looking at how landscape diversity contributes towards dietary diversity. So some examples. In Ethiopia, the work of Stephen Wood, who works for CIMMYT, and which is basically the wheat and maize center, found that wheat grown in close proximity to forest patches had not only had higher levels of micronutrients, particularly molybdenum, manganese, zinc, and iron, but also had higher yields. Pretty cool stuff. The secret obviously is in the soil. So the further away you get from forest, those yields diminished dramatically. And a really good example that we've just published from work in Zambia. Does anybody know what this is? So, sorry? You're one of my students, you can't say. Honestly, Dilling. Yes, this is fall armyworm, thanks for that. So fall armyworm was introduced to West Africa a few years ago and has basically spread through Southern Africa in particular and is decimating the maize production there. We were in Zambia in July seeing how bad it really is, but also seeing that there are some interesting areas where intensive maize is grown in proximity of forest and trees, and we're seeing a mediation effect whereby the predation of either bats, birds, or other predators actually play an important role in controlling fall armyworm. So again, the role of forests and trees in mediating agricultural production and is extremely important. And these are just 2 examples. I mean, there are many, many examples that we're generating a huge database of the type of literature needed to sort of justify this forest sustaining agriculture paradigm. This is an example from Sumatra, some work we did with Christine Paddock and others, a landscape where it was basically designed, if you like, for different foodstuffs, different land use activities, based on long-term work that Christine Paddock at the time, she'd been working in this area for about 45, 50 years, and had seen this landscape evolve and how it had been managed for food and other goods and services over that period of time. And you can see forest cover is extremely high. Some really other good examples. This is from the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh, a mixture of semi-permanent crops, but also swidden agriculture, where small areas of forest are cleared on an annual basis and allowed to recover. Upland rice in Cat Ba in Vietnam, the same thing. Small, relatively short fallows, and Mondulkiri in Cambodia, showing the same patterns of use. And biologically, these areas are interesting because they create a patchwork of different succession systems, and in fact, more diverse than the more homogeneous forest that they replace. And because of the dynamic nature of some of these fallows at different ages, we get a much higher level of biodiversity across that landscape, although it doesn't look like it. Many policymakers think of this as the sole cause of deforestation. In Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, shifting cultivation is actually banned. It's illegal to clear land for shifting cultivation, which is just ridiculous when you think of the rubber expansion and the other commodity expansion in each of those countries. So just moving back to BC, Jennifer Grent's provided some really cool evidence of stuff that's been happening here. And I've been using this particular example, looking at functional traits, of domestication basically in BC, and how people have been manipulating and managing the forests here for much longer than we realize for forests and food. And Jennifer made a really cool point. Colonial foresters, when they arrived here, did not understand what they were looking at. So this piece of forest here, most of us, ignorant foresters, would think that would be some kind of production system. We pick out the Douglas fir and the western red cedar and set aside that for production. But in fact, it is a mosaic of different food crops, different stages of succession, managed in a way that there's a much complex interaction between the structure of the forest and the food system that it actually inhabits. And this has been much misunderstood, both in BC, but also elsewhere. And I'll touch on that again in a second. So what we're saying is, we've got all this evidence that shows that people rely on forests and trees and tree-based systems for food security, dietary diversity, and increased nutrition. Yet, on the other hand, we have a paradigm where we're moving towards protecting large areas of the terrestrial world. The HE targets, which weren't achieved, were intending to set aside 17% of the terrestrial part of the world and 10% of coastal marine areas. Half Earth movement is pretty strong, started by E.O. Wilson. Let's set aside half the Earth. Where the heck does everybody go? It doesn't live in that, the other parts of the world. And the 30 by 30, which is also not uncontroversial. But are these pristine wildernesses? And evidence has been produced for the last 40, 50 years. When I first started as an undergraduate, the director of Kew, where I studied, had just come from the New York Botanical Garden. Their work unequivocally showed that large areas of the Amazon were inhabited, they were managed, the current floral systems, the florific systems, were a manifestation of millennia of management and manipulation and domestication. That's in the early 80s. Technologies have changed now. We've got phylogenies, we've got DNA analysis, and much of this evidence is being reinforced. So we're not dealing with pristine wildernesses. We're dealing with management systems, forestry systems that have been managed, manipulated for food, for other goods and services for longer than we care to imagine. So when we turn up and see what we think of as a pristine wilderness is in fact a much more complex management system than we can understand. So it goes back to the issue of food as a basic human right. Essentially, the right to food is enshrined in all of the UN charters, particularly for the 1948 post-UN. What happened? What did I press? So food is a basic human right. So on the one hand, we're saying forests and trees provide a fantastic repository of dietary diversity and nutrition. On the other hand, actually, we're going to annex that from people because people are part of a destructive system in those systems. So what we see regularly is the denial of access. Would you like to unmute my microphone to speak? Okay, let's give me some weird commands here. Essentially, the loss of access to some of these wild foods is problematic, particularly in the context of protected areas. This particular example on the left was from an organization I used to work with. I did not produce this particular tweet, but this happens on a regular basis, that people's access to food and basic foodstuffs and goods and services are restricted by overzealous game guards. This particular hunter had been caught with 2 duikers and a porcupine outside of a protected area. Both species are highly fecund, they're not protected, yet he was sentenced to 6 months in jail. This plays out across tropical landscapes throughout the world. That people's access and right to food are not being respected, and this needs to be addressed in the context of both 30 by 30, the Half Earth movement, and other commitments to restrict and create more protected areas. Frederick, you got a strange system going on here, dude. So we have essentially been trying to untangle these issues. How do we promote biodiversity conservation in the context of climate change in particular, but also respect people's rights and access to some of these protected areas? Is it sustainable use? Is it complete annexation? Are we thinking about multifunctional landscapes? We need to think about some of these more complex approaches to land use, way more than just the dichotomies between agriculture and forestry. And this issue of wilderness, I'm going to go back to this. I mentioned earlier indigenous stewardship and management of long-term indigenous stewardship and management of forest resources. And this paper came out earlier this year, or last year, sorry, and basically talks about how stewardship should be changed away from that paradigm of strict conservation to much more integrated indigenous focused management. So the role of smallholders, the largest probably ignored group of anyone producing food in the world. We know that they produce between 30 and 80%. I don't know why that variation is so wide, but a vast amount of the world's food is produced by smallholders in multifunctional landscape mosaics. They produce a wide range of products in systems that are much more resilient to economic and environmental shocks, but receive almost little or no support in terms of subsidies. You think about the subsidies given to the farmers of Saskatchewan or the farmers of Europe or Southeast Asia. It's just ridiculous that these very productive farmers growing food in very biodiverse, multifunctional landscapes that provide a wide range of goods and services, not just food, are being basically ignored. And they provide a unique opportunity to really look at this issue of conservation in a much more sustainable use way, rather than this annexation versus agricultural dichotomy we're continually faced with. And smallholder farmers are far better at conserving agrobiodiversity than anybody else on Earth, any other production system. So the thing and Dylan, please don't say anything here, because I know you're going to say something. So the thing I often bring up in class is the so what factor. Okay, we've got all this evidence. What do we do with it? So there were 2 major global processes looking at forests and food and how we can change the policy arena related to this paradigm. The first was from the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, produced a global forest expert panel report. Everything's an expert report in 2015, and basically came to the conclusion that forests and trees have a role to play in achieving global food security, particularly from the aspect, not necessarily direct provisioning, but from the ecosystem service perspective. The UN's Committee on World Food Security commissioned a report, which was published in 2017, which essentially provided recommendations based on integrating forestry and agriculture, making sure that rights, tenure, and access were respected in terms of smallholder farmers and those requiring access to forest resources. This was a big deal. I actually chaired this process, and standing in front of, I was at the FAO recently with Rob, and sitting in that room when you've got 2,000 delegates and having to present some of these findings is extremely intimidating. Not quite as intimidating as speaking in forestry, of course, but the key issues here were the UFRO report was really trying to get foresters. You remember my earlier quote, what the heck has food security got to do with forestry? Getting foresters to or the forest community to understand the role of forests and trees in food security and provision of ecosystem services. But the toughest nut to crack has been the nutrition community, the land and food systems folks. I'm sure they're all very nice, but we've had very little interaction with these communities. I don't mean the faculty, I mean the people who work on land and food systems. And there's been very little sort of cross-pollination, if you like, of the two disciplines in understanding how forests and food can contribute to nutrition and dietary diversity. So how do we further that policy arena? And is it through the SDGs? Is it SDG 2, hunger? And we're now sort of quite a long way into the SDG and 2030 agenda, and progress seems to be extremely slow. Again, the Committee on Forestry that Rob and I attended with Hosni in just last month, there was a really nice briefing note on agriculture and forestry linkages, but they went far too short of actually making any commitment. The recognition of the provision of critical ecosystem services was great to see, but that's all there was. I would love to see a program of work on how we can integrate those ecosystem services into agricultural production systems. And it seems that every time we go through a policy process, we fall just a little bit short of implementation and adoption. And there's lots of these types of blogs come out. We need to revolutionize our food system or face mass deforestation. Well, deforestation is happening anyway, despite all the commitments. There are countries that have managed to increase their food security without clearing forests, and in fact, have managed to increase not only their food security capacity and potential, but also increase forest cover. But there's a strong movement towards thinking of trees in a broader context of agroecology and moving towards a much more integrated agriculture. But of course, we've also seen health issues, spillover effects, COVID-19 pandemic, whether there's a spillover effect from forests, whether that's conclusive or not, but there are spillover effects. We've had Ebola, we've had Zika, we've had many other HIV/AIDS, we've had many spillover effects because of our persistent entry into the forest frontier and the spillover from animals to humans. Basic health, deforestation in Brazil has been correlated with much higher levels of malaria and other insect-borne diseases. In Cameroon, work from one of my students has shown that pernicious anemia increases in urban populations, but people who have access to wild leafy vegetables, it's almost negligible. So we're seeing strong linkages between obviously nutrition, dietary diversity, and human health, which have largely been ignored by the mainstream agricultural community. And even the agronomy community, these are two colleagues of mine that work with CIMMYT, with the Rice and Wheat and Maize Center as part of the CGIAR, recognize that the current agricultural system of penetrating that forest frontier needs to be changed. That paradigm needs to shift dramatically. So in terms of key messages on forests and food, essentially, we need to think carefully about this forest frontier encroachment by agriculture and moving away from that commodity production. Indonesia and other countries have made great progress in avoiding deforestation and moratoriums on the expansion of oil palm. But declarations such as COP26 need to actually be acted upon. We're a year in and not much has happened. And these are voluntary contributions. I remember being in New York for the New York Declaration of Forests. It's all very exciting. Have any of the targets been achieved? No, they haven't. COP26, has the money that's been set aside to avoid deforestation actually been disseminated? No, it hasn't. It goes on, it goes on, it goes on, and it's hard not to be cynical at times. We know that, particularly from looking at smallholder cropping systems, that they're much more resilient, particularly to environmental and economic shocks. And ecosystem services provided by forests and trees are extremely important, not only in terms of maintaining resilience, but also in terms of contributing towards agricultural production systems. So it goes back to the work that people like Jeff and others do here, thinking about managing landscapes from a multifunctional perspective, getting away from just the forestry, agriculture, mining, whatever it might be, paradigms, moving into this much more integrated approach, and how they can focus to contribute to a wide range of goods and services. And here's the thing. So I have presented this, some of this evidence at agricultural meetings, and I've actually been called all kinds of things. But I guess the politest problem was I was in Rwanda and presented all this work on forests and trees and how much they contribute towards food security. And somebody at the back, not one of you people, don't worry. Actually, I could see a potential person. Yeah, I thought it might be you. Actually said, this is just bullshit. This is bullshit. And today we've reached 8 billion people. So his argument would be, we've got 8 billion people, so we need more food. But the problem with that linear thinking is that he's talking about calories. He's talking about the pervasive paradigm of increasing expenses of wheat and rice, the staple crops, but not producing enough nutritious food. So it's very much a dichotomizer and divisive argument when we start to talk about the integration of forest trees and conventional agriculture. It doesn't mean we don't need the wheat fields of Ukraine and Saskatchewan. It means that we can have other alternative complementary food systems as well. And I think that's the key sort of takeaway for me, many of these issues. And the discourse has started to change. Last night, I spent hours and hours and hours at this particular event, organized by the Korean Forest Service and the Korean Society of Forest Sciences. And they have a fantastic program of integrating forest and food security. It's probably the most advanced of anywhere in the world. And it was, although it was late, it was a joy to be part of that process. So it's still on the agenda. The international agenda still has interest in this issue, and we just need to keep that momentum going. And it'll be good to talk, I think, from a faculty to faculty perspective with land and food systems and maybe IRES and how they do very similar work, and work that could be very complementary to the types of things we're doing. So I want to leave you with this, and I'll probably get some flack and some trolling on Twitter for this. So I come across this paper about 6 months ago, written by John Gowdy, who's a retired professor, whose thesis is basically, I think there's something here. What he's saying is, for the last 300,000 years, we've been hunter-gatherers. We've been extremely fortunate to have 10 to 12,000 years of climatic stability that agriculture has been able to happen. We've been able to feed a growing population. But current projections of climate change and temperature change, if we go beyond the 1.5 or 2 degree increases in temperature, we're entering a world which would look like the Pleistocene. We're going to see major vicissitudes of climate, much more extremes of climate, where agriculture won't be possible. So his dystopian vision is that we will all become hunter-gatherers again, or in fact, society will just collapse. It's an interesting paper. I read it on a Friday afternoon and I was traumatized for the whole weekend. But it made me think, you know, what are we doing? And we're seeing now in Sharm el-Sheikh discussions going on, it's COP27. Think about that, COP27. This is almost 30 years of talking and still very little action. And those 1.5, 2 degree targets that were set in Paris are not going to be achieved. So there are some projections that say it could be 8%. 8 degrees, 9 degrees increases. That would have a devastating effect on our potential agriculture and civilization as a whole. It's fairly existential issues that we're sort of facing now. I don't want to be a total bummer, But I think we need to be aware of the potential extremes that we could be facing, and whether this becomes commonplace. If this happens every year, the agriculture of the Fraser Valley, the breadbasket of BC is going to be affected, as well as extremes of fire and other things that are going to basically not allow us to have the same kind of agriculture that we expect and we could become used to and complacent to. On that cheery note, I'll end. And there's my Twitter. You can troll me anytime. Most people do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the interesting and informative presentation. Thanks a lot. Are there any questions?
This is not, this question is not about.
You made a comment I picked up on earlier in your talk about a forester looking at forestry I mean, that's quite a damning critique of the education of foresters. And how can we change that view of the forest as an institution of education? Okay, I should have caveated that with, I know that everyone in this room knows that's not the case.
Okay.
Because I believe, of course, you know, we as a forestry faculty understand, was that famous quote from Fred Bunnell, forestry is not rocket science, it's much more complicated than that. And of course, I think all of us in this room and in this faculty understand that forestry is not just about production systems. And the way that the faculty has changed, just in the short time I've been here, from that focus on production, silviculture, to a much more embracing the social issues of forestry, gender issues, indigenous rights issues. That's, you know, of course, that's a given. Forestry is a very complicated catch-all umbrella. And I remember when I was at C4, we went through 3 strategic planning processes. And I have to say, we spent at least 2 days during each of those processes talking about what is forestry. And it's more, what is it? The logo here is more than you think. So yes, it wasn't damning in terms of the faculty itself. It was damning in terms of the public perception of forestry here. And I don't think a lot of people here realize, the person on the street realizes the complexity of forestry and its all-embracing aspect in terms of food, ecosystem services, not just timber production. So you got me there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Terry. Still working?
Yeah.
Okay. So all these tree planting programs, millions and billions of trees, how would you recommend they be planted?
Going back to the Korean example. So after the Korean War in the 50s, they had, I think it was 5 to 8% forest cover, which was reduced from 90% before the war. And what they did obviously had to do a number of things. They demobilized the military, and there were a lot of displaced communities. And as part of the restoration program, they actually consulted the communities who had been displaced as to what type of trees did people want to plant. And they will be assisted by the demobilized military. And so there's this incredible cultural emphasis on fruit trees that sort of promote mushroom production in the autumn. There's a strong kind of cultural heritage of harvesting forest foods. So it was very much a bottom-up system. When you see countries who say, we planted 1 billion trees today, well, what trees? On whose land? Where? How? Who's going to tend those trees? Because the mortality is going to be really high. There are 2 types, or a number of different types of forest landscape restoration. But I think it has to be, too much of it's top down. You look at the Bond Challenge, Africa 100, it's very much top down. And it's not about creating worthwhile ecosystems in many respects, it's about ticking boxes. And I hate to be cynical about that, but it does seem to be the case.
We have one question from the chat. If we go to the chat, please, Terry. from Sarah.
Rob. Well, I mean, there are some of us who are a part of the Land and Food Systems Research Cluster, and we get together and we talk about some of these issues. But should there be more cross-pollination in seminars like this? Should we have workshops that talk about different ways we think about land and food systems, whether they're tree-based, whether they're agricultural-based, and understanding other perspectives in terms of achieving global food security?
Yes, Sean.
Oh, knew it.
I was going to say something with an acronym with 2 letters, but I'm not going to do it. But so I wanted to ask you a question that might be a little bit off the wall, but if we move to a system where forest and agriculture are so tightly knit, or move to a system that uses more for production systems, do we have to be concerned about transfer of potential viruses and diseases from the agricultural system into the forest, which are long-lived organisms, versus the agricultural crop are usually on an annual basis? And you can think about what's happening right now with lettuce. The cost of lettuce, if you haven't noticed, has gone crazy through the roof in the grocery stores. And that's largely because first drought and now a virus that's caused problems with California lettuce. And we're waiting the prices to drop. That'll be when we get lettuce from Arizona. So is there a possibility that with increasing climate and increasing pressure to maximize production in these small spaces, that we might see vertical transfer to long-lived organisms, and then it would be detrimental to forestry?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my earlier point about you still need to have your segregated agriculture. So I think things like market gardening, that type of thing, would still maintain itself as a separate entity. But I think the integration of forests and trees into other systems, where did I go recently? There was a fantastic example of hazelnuts and blueberries and raspberries and other fruit bushes being grown together, which is in a mixed system. I think the market gardening thing is probably not the best example, because they're not going to grow under a forest canopy or shade. But other crops that are much more sort of adaptable to that forest shade environment would be better. I'm coming primarily from a tropical perspective too, so my knowledge of the systems that you're talking about is fairly limited.
Why not just move to aquatic plant-based diets?
In terms of
Nutrition, you want high density nutrients. Why not go to ocean algal populations and look at high density foods?
Because the oceans are doing so well at the moment. Oh no, it's all the usual suspects.
Yes,
Hello.
that was a bit of a bummer at the end.
Sorry?
It was a bit of a bummer at the end, your presentation.
What I also forgot to caveat that with, having thought about that over the weekend, his dystopian view would probably be sort of counteracted by technology. If that really was the case, that agriculture collapsed, we'd probably all be living on Soylent Green or something similar. But I think technology would find a way. But that's by the by. So you please go ahead.
Can you just explain a little further, like the link between, because I've heard this before about how COVID and pandemics, and you mentioned Ebola and that. Can you hear me?
No, I didn't hear what you just said there.
This is for the people on Zoom. Okay, so I was just asking, can you explain a bit further how things like COVID-19 and Ebola and how those link to the forest and the overspill? Just because if we've always been traditionally hunter-gatherers and living in the forest, I'm just trying to understand in my own head because I've heard it, but I don't understand how it works.
So basically, there would be an infected animal a bat, or in the case of Ebola in Guinea and Sierra Leone, a chimp that was obviously ill and was taken back to the village and was consumed by a family, and the Ebola basically spilled over from the carcass of the chimp to the community in, I think it was Guinea initially, and then it was spread to Liberia and Sierra Leone. And that's fairly common with other diseases. Marburg virus, Ebola was transmitted from bats to a human host. HIV, again, the hypothesis is that it was in Central Africa, a hunter would have butchered a carcass, and there would have blood-to-blood exchange, probably around the 1950s, if the DNA work is correct. So it's a fairly, it's not common, but it readily happens in the forest frontier where you have that exchange. It wouldn't have spread quite so far when people lived in smaller bands. There was less migration between areas and less transportation routes. What we're seeing now is that these things spread much quicker because of our connectivity, our telecoupled societies. Does that make sense? No, because the idea would be to avoid the forest frontier and to basically promote food production in accessible forests that have already been relatively converted.
Thanks, Terry. Great talk. COP27 is happening, as you noted. I know you're skeptical of the outcomes of these COPs, as am I. But arguably, food and agriculture is more present at this COP than has ever been in the past. And I'm just curious to see your thoughts as to whether or not that's a good thing. I mean, climate change as a framing can sometimes take over every other aspect of a problem, right? And so I'm just curious as your thoughts in terms of that food, agriculture, climate nexus and how it might play out.
The problem is that last year it was forests. This year it's food and agriculture. What's it going to be next year? And I think the problem is, I've been to, of the 27 COPs, I've been to about 15, and it gets a little jarring after a while. I don't mean that I don't want to perpetuate the blah blah blah, but I want people to stand by their commitments. I saw Boris Johnson, God bless him, make commitments to finance which have never been realized. And if you're going to make these things and grandstand, have some credibility and follow through. And I think that's where it gets frustrating. And it's whether it's the HE targets, whether it's the SDGs, whether it's the Millennium Development Goals, we continually make targets which we do not achieve. And I think, of course, they're voluntary. There's no accountability. There are no sticks. There are plenty of carrots. But either achieve the targets or don't make them. But I take your point. Yes, there's a lot of dialogue this year about food and agriculture. But there was a report this morning saying that all of the global commodity producers that promised zero deforestation by 2030 are completely off kilter, and they're not going to achieve anything. So the Unilevers, all the many of the oil palm companies, sorry Jeff, in Indonesia and Malaysia, none are going to achieve their targets for zero deforestation on their value chains.
Hi, can you hear me? Well, thank you for the presentation. My question is actually more related to the last part of your presentation, and also it's a question related to personal stuff, like being hopeful when we're doing research of the sorts that you're doing right now, and many of us. Is it okay if, despite all the research that we're doing, and we're trying our best, all of us, being hopeless comes sometimes, or maybe deep down inside, knowing that with all the work that we're doing, with the pace that we've seen from the governments and joining their forces and everybody else, like being seeing everything happening, at the end of the day with the climate change, food security, everything, we're going to just be ending up somewhere that is a disastrous point, because that's my state of mind at the moment. That's whatever I do, I'm like always thinking, okay, so but with all the things that we see, it doesn't matter how much we're working. I know that it's important we try our best, but deep down inside, I'm a little bit hopeless.
Deep down inside,
I'm a little bit hopeless. I'm thinking that with all the actions that we don't see from the government and also the industry, in terms of like reducing the climate impacts or everything like that, it doesn't seem, I cannot imagine reducing the climate impacts, for example, by 2030 or 2050, and also with everything involved, I think it may not happen. I don't know. As I said, it's not research related. I'm just thinking, is it okay as researchers we feel that way?
it's a tough one, isn't it? Getting the balance right between being realistic and hopeful. We had a, shall I bring that up? Okay, we had a session about 2 years ago with the Masters of International Forestry students, and it was a fairly negative session. And I felt actually the one thing we should be doing is imparting hope. Many of you are young professionals in the early part of your career. Without hope, what is there? And I don't get up in the morning and go, oh my God, woe is me, the world's ending. I do have hope. And although I've presented stuff here that maybe can be interpreted as unhopeful, it's not at all. It's about realizing what the, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, did I? Oh, I thought I was done. So we had every year we do a session on what makes you hopeful as young professional people, and the things that worry you, how can they be tempered by that hope? And I think that's an important balance. So you realize what the issues are, but also understand what the potential is to change you as an individual, us as a faculty, us as a society, for a more hopeful future, because otherwise nobody would get out of bed. So yes, it's important to realize what the issues are, and some things are really bad, and that some things can be mediated. But the fact we're talking about these things is a huge difference. 30 years ago, when I first started my undergraduate, there was a fantastic book that was published by E.O. Wilson called Biodiversity. It was the first real textbook, and those of you, probably quite a few of you in the room who know this book. But there was a great chapter in there that said, tropical forests going, gone. So by the year 2000, all the tropical forests would be gone. Now, I'm going to refer to Jeff and others. I've flown over the Congo Basin, I've flown over Borneo, I've flown over the Amazon Basin. There's still vast amounts of forest out there. The apocalyptic scenarios, dystopian vision of the world hasn't necessarily played out. So that gives you hope. The fact that all these projections have changed, and conservation in particular is a crisis discipline. They want you to put your money in their little thing that they shake outside supermarkets, because the world is going through all these traumas. But really, we haven't seen, in many respects, of course we have in some respects, but we haven't seen the results of the types of trauma, the types of Armageddon that we expected to see in 2000. And what was the next target? 2010. The next target was 2020. So a lot of the scenarios that have been projected haven't played out because people are becoming more aware. Dialogue is changing. But I have to say, we also need to be a bit more vocal. Those of us who are researchers and have the knowledge, the evidence to engage with society should do it more. And I know there's a fine line between advocacy and research, but I think perhaps we have more of a responsibility to get out there and say, especially those of us who are older, have not much to lose, and no, seriously, get out there and say, this is not right. And the kind of political change you alluded to, that will only happen if people are out on the streets. Let's get out there.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Special thanks to those who joined us virtually. And at the end, I would like to thank everyone who helped us with the seminar. Karen, Steph, Fabian, Frederick, Michelle, thanks a lot. And also my grad students who set up the room. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. See you soon for our 4th seminar series. Thank you. Bye.